Hello, everyone. Welcome to Overthink. I am co-host Ellie Anderson, and I'm excited here to share with our viewers today the work of two wonderful philosophers in this interview about a recently published book, both of whom I've known for a very long time, and one of whom many of our viewers will recognize. Can I just have you both briefly introduce yourselves? Give us your name, where you work, if there's any other things you want to mention.
All right, well, I'll go first. I'm David Peña-Guzmán, and I am a co-host of Overthink. Many of you obviously know who I am, but you are seeing a trio here from Emory University.
Yeah, I'm Rebekah Spera. I came in the same year as David in graduate school, and Ellie also was in our graduate program. And I am the co-author of the book that David and I wrote called Professional Philosophy and Its Myths.
Ooh, I love that you actually have it, Rebekah.
Of course.
Have an e-copy. We've mentioned the book on Overthink before. It's obviously been something that's been close to both of your hearts for quite some time now. And David, yes, as the person who's usually on the other side of things along with me, it's fun to have the shoe on the other foot this time. But you have mentioned the book in some of our Overthink episodes. We have also gently noted to our readers that it is priced for libraries. So don't be extremely alarmed to our viewers if you go and check this out and are shocked by the price. Unfortunately, the nature of academic publishing today, which is, kind of germane to the topic of the book, is such that books tend to be very expensive. So please recommend that your library purchase it. I don't know if you guys want to say anything else about access to the book, but yeah, I think recommending libraries to purchase it is the perfect thing to do. Let's get into it then. So yeah, I love the idea of a book that is a metaphilosophical analysis of academic philosophy. And so for our viewers, if you know a lot about academic philosophy and you feel frustrated by it, this book is for you. If you don't know a lot about academic philosophy, then you will learn a lot about it from this interview and this book. And you argue in this analysis of academic philosophy that philosophy is full of myths, hence the title, Professional Philosophy and Its Myths. And this might initially seem like a strange claim because typically, at least going back to ancient Greek times, philosophy has distinguished itself from myth. It is the field that does away with myth, that demystifies, that moves us away from mythological thinking and roots us in what will later become science. And so tell us about how you're using the term myth here and why we should be thinking about philosophy as full of myths.
Yes, thanks, Ellie, for that question. So we are not using myth in the way maybe a lot of people might think to define the term as the opposite of logos. There is reason, rationality, conceptual analysis, and then on the other side, there is myth understood as something that is opposite to that which is true, right? It's like a lie or a fancy story that we tell for various purposes. Rather, what we mean by the term myth is a kind of story or an account that communities often tell and tell themselves repeatedly in order to make sense of the social roles and expectations that hold within that community. It just so happens that the community that we're interested in talking about is the community of academic philosophers. So the book really is about the narratives that philosophers have inherited from the past of their own discipline about what it means to be a philosopher, what it means to engage in philosophical labor, and what it means to see oneself as a member of the philosophical community. And of course, if we think about the term myth in a broader sense, we tell different kinds of myths. There are cosmological myths. We tell stories about where the universe came from. This is important in metaphysics and in religion. We also have political myths, right? Like the myth of the American patriot, for example, right? That give a sense of unity to a political group. Myths also have other functions, like sociological functions and educational functions, right? The educational function of a myth is tied to its capacity to teach a lesson. In school, we teach kids all kinds of myths because they are an easy to convey story that transmits important information. And so in the book, I think the best way to think about what we mean when we say that philosophy is full of myths is to think of myth in its sociological and educational sense. It's a way of forming identities in a group and having those identities perform a pedagogical function relative to those who identify with that community.
Yeah, and I'll add something to myths. And these myths are not necessarily monolithic, and they're not necessarily something that every philosopher would explicitly avow and say, yes, I believe this about philosophy. Some of them are less so, but we argue that these myths are operational materially in the profession. And when you look at the profession and its practices from an empirical point of view, some of the things that philosophers do are very difficult to explain if we don't reference these particular myths about what it is we do and who we are as philosophers.
Can you tell us more about that? So let's get into what these myths are.
So we identify a number of different myths that inform what it means to be a philosopher. The first, or one of them, is this notion of the philosopher as maverick. This is a term that we coined. And this we use to refer to this notion that philosophers have a special relationship with truth. You referenced logos, right? This notion that the philosopher is the lover of wisdom, the one who is able to see reality as it is. And there's a component to that where part of that myth has to do with the idea that the philosopher, by virtue of their relationship with truth, stands against a community, i.e., exist in a way and speak the truth in a way that others don't like. The kind of you think about the myth of Socrates, or not the myth, but the story of Socrates, who was put to death because he spoke the truth, right, in Athens. This is kind of a governing myth in philosophy, and it paints the picture of somebody who stands at odds in a given community. And we see this actually even in the philosophical community, philosophers thinking that they stand in a minoritarian position even within their own field. So it's very much a solitary notion. And we actually, there's this wonderful study that we cite, which is the Chalmers survey, What Philosophers Believe, where they surveyed philosophers about what they thought about, realism, materialism, relativism, etc. And they had another part of the survey where they were asking, how many other philosophers do you think share your beliefs? And consistently, philosophers underestimate how widely their beliefs are shared in their own profession. And we think that this comes from the figure of the philosopher as this bold and perhaps persecuted speaker of truth, right?
Yeah, I think that the notion of persecution is really important to that myth, because there is this sense that you often get, even as an undergrad, when you're taking philosophy classes, that philosophers are persecuted by their community, even sometimes by other philosophers for having views that are too radical. And so this notion that the philosopher represents a threat to the established order is so baked into our understanding of what philosophy is. And part of our argument is that it makes us sometimes believe that philosophy is inherently radical, which ends up concealing many of the ways in which philosophy is not radical at all. And in fact, there is a very long history of philosophers capitulating to power. So for every story of a radical Socrates, you can have a counter story of somebody who lived perfectly well in cahoots with established forms of power.
Heidegger.
But one example.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm wondering too, how much you think this is philosophy in general and how much of it is American professional philosophy. Because when I think about the maverick idea, I feel it's in some sense a pretty Anglo-American phenomenon, in the sense that when I go to Europe, as both of you are familiar with, having spent a lot of time in Germany and France respectively, there's a sense of the sort of master and you kind of listen to whatever they say and you believe whatever they say. And I remember, talking to a French friend who expressed shock that my philosophy students as undergrads feel qualified to disagree with Descartes. And so I think there's, an appeal to authority that you more often find in European contexts, and maybe less of a sense of needing to come up with your own original position, at least not coming up with your own original position until you've gone through your full education and you finally come out the other side. So I'm curious, what you think about this in context outside the US.
So I'll just start off, and then David, you can add on. Very briefly put, I will say the scope of our particular analysis is limited linguistically to Anglo-American philosophy and discourse on philosophy in that field. 1. 2, I would say that while there might be less of a notion that we're, in a European educational system, we're going to encourage everyone to speak their own ideas. There's kind of more of an emphasis on training, as you say, under a kind of master. Nevertheless, that itself actually connects to another myth that we identify in the book, which is this notion that philosophy is kind of a succession of great minds, as if like we have these singular geniuses and we sort of associate or affiliate ourselves by saying, I am a Hegelian or I am a Marxist. And so while it is, I don't want to make claims for academic contexts I'm less familiar with, but honestly, that doesn't seem so far afield from other mythological lineages and patterns that we've traced. David, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I would also add that there might be a difference here between being a student of philosophy and being a philosopher who is recognized as such because, you've reached a certain level of celebrity or recognition or influence. And so we might say that the students are not yet philosophers. That's why they are under the protection and the guiding influence of a master, but Descartes himself, qua philosopher, does represent this maverick-like figure who,
for sure.
Challenges tradition, especially given the association of Descartes specifically with like the birth of modernity, right? Like he cut the umbilical cord of the past in the way in which we often talk about the history of philosophy. And I think all of these masters, another myth that we talk about in the book is that we call it the myth of the philosopher as one. The idea that philosophers just create their philosophy almost by fiat through this act of creation ex nihilo, and in particular in solitude. So the idea here is that in order to philosophize, because this is a myth about philosophical labor and philosophical work, in order to philosophize, you have to enact a break from the real world. You have to recede or withdraw into this space of pure thought where, like Descartes, in his very famous stove-heated room, you can then engage in philosophical thinking. And one thing to observe about all these myths is that our motivation for identifying and naming these myths is not just to say, hey, there are these myths peppered throughout the history of philosophy, but it's to point out how they continue to influence in very real and palpable ways what we do as academic philosophers. So, for example, that myth of the philosopher as one, we argue, is the reason, and it's specific, or at least like particularly accentuated in philosophy, it may be the reason why philosophy does not accept, as a general rule, collaborative projects, right? Because the idea is that a philosopher must have his or her philosophy that belongs to them, right? Like Heidegger's thought, Marx's thought. And so there's an analysis in the book of the lack of co-authorship and in a spirit of collaboration in academic philosophy that we trace back to some of these myths.
And do you think the solution to that is more co-authorship and collaboration?
So, I think we're pretty pro co-authorship and collaboration, but I think we have bigger fish that we are attempting to fry. So it's not just a matter of clearing the way for more co-authorship. And in fact, we trace a number of these myths and a number of their effects as they reverberate throughout the profession, from its continual diversity issues, lack of diversity issues, I should probably clarify, its hostility to women, its particular aversion to thinking of ourselves as laborers specifically, the kind of anti-solidaristic effects of this notion of the philosopher as one. We can talk about that in greater detail later, but it's not just co-authorship. It's not just we wake up and we suddenly collaborate and we're free of these myths, right? We're trying to trace a kind of network of effects that shape professional philosophy as it's practiced today.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about some of the things that initially attracted me to philosophy and keep me within philosophy. In addition to like what keeps me in philosophy mainly is the fact that after having contingent precarious positions for years, I finally got a tenure track job. And I know you guys have a lot to say about that. So like that is first and foremost a rare and lucky job security is what keeps me in philosophy. And the conditions under which we work are highly unjust because it shouldn't be like a rare and lucky situation that I'm in. We know there's a lot of demand for philosophy classes, but the adjunct crisis just keeps getting worse and worse. So yeah, we can absolutely return to that if you wish. But I think if I'm thinking about like that initial attraction, and then now that I do have this lucky position, like what I like most about my job and why I keep doing it. And to be honest, a lot of it is the solitude. I have co-authored a couple of articles and I've really enjoyed that experience. I've co-translated as well. But my favorite thing to do is wake up in the morning, go to my room alone, or go to my office, or I just finally got an office. It used to be just like my living room or my kitchen, but like be somewhere alone and spend hours reading and writing. And when I'm thinking about, I recently completed my first book project, and that was a almost entirely solitary affair from a certain vantage point, which is that on the ground, I was working alone. I did have, some experiences where I would share work in progress with other people. One of our other friends from grad school, Roshni Patel, and I had an accountability group. And so she would give me feedback on my work and we would check in periodically. But aside from the fact that I was talking to Roshni pretty frequently about the project, like I was really alone with my books, disagreeing with previous philosophers who had single authored pieces before me because I thought they were wrong. And so I guess I'm curious what you all think about that, because I do feel just personally that the kind of solitude we get is something precious, and maybe that it would be in some ways nice for people to have a bit more of, especially relative to some of the collaborative models that you see in Europe, for instance. I actually like a lot less than what we have here, which is that like in European universities, the humanities are increasingly falling under a STEM model, which emphasizes collaboration and co-authorship. And I don't think that's always for the better, because it gives people less freedom to pursue their own projects.
David, I'll just say a couple of things. I think we probably would want to distinguish between like personal preference and something like a mythic form of imagining what is really philosophy.
Okay.
So I agree with you. I am similarly like misanthropic in my work. I enjoy being Descartes alone in my study. That's what attracted me to philosophy, of course. I think of myself as a kind of sui generis thinker, right? But no, I'm not saying that's what you're saying. But it's not like we're trying to do away with solitude or trying to make us more like the sciences, heaven forbid. But rather to kind of trace the ways these myths or these ways we think about our activity doesn't just affect like, oh, I go into my room, I read the thinkers, and then I write, but also obscures the nature of your labor, and actually prevents like more solidaristic ways of thinking, and also the question of like intellectual indebtedness. And I to be clear, I don't think that you don't have this idea, Ellie, but
no, it's okay. I invited you to like put me on blast. Like, go for it.
Oh no, I have no interest in putting you on blast. There are many people I would put on blast, not you. But just what we want to distinguish though between like the personal preference or the idea that we're trying to be like STEM, but reimagining philosophy in a different way that will allow it to be more expansive rather than less. So it's not a matter of forcing everyone into co-authorship, which is not really what we're after here. David, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Well, no, and I think, Ellie, you got to it a little bit with your own clarification, because you said, I love my solitude, and that is an issue of preference. But you also said, I also had a writing accountability group and all these things. And I think that really gets at the issue for us about the difference between solitude and its mythologization, that when you mythologize it, it really obscures the material reality of how many of us, including those of us who like our solitude, produce. A lot of the ideas that I've generated and that I literally write in solitude, they formed in conversation with students, in classes, going to professional conferences, in discussions and dialogue with mentors. And yet the way we talk about what it takes to be a philosopher and what philosophical activity looks like rarely mentions those quote unquote footnotes. And so for us, it's about foregrounding what is often pushed into the background as a way of highlighting the limits of the myth and suggesting that maybe a different self-conception for each and every one of us is possible when we pay a little bit more attention to what we are, if we're able to think what we're actually doing. Yeah. And that's a phrase that we take from Hannah Arendt, who says, thoughtful reflection is really seeing what you're doing and thinking it on its own terms as it really is.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And obviously, I mean, part of the reason that we're doing this interview at all, part of the reason that you co-authored, part of the reason that David and I have Overthink together, is because we all went to grad school together and formed a really beautiful community. And actually, Rebekah, I remember the exact time and place okay, I should say I remember the place. I don't actually remember the time, other than it was after a colloquium. So I remember the time in that sense. I couldn't tell you what month or even what year it was. But you and I were out to dinner after colloquium at like either that pizza place or the place that cycled in after the pizza place, but it was right in Emory Village. And you were like, Ellie, you gotta read Fichte given your projects. And I hadn't read any Fichte at that point. I was probably like 24 years old or something. And then now, you know, many years later, I feel like that I have read Fichte and I love Fichte, and I thought that I was even going to have work on Fichte in my book, and then it barely touched on. But I think it's just funny how that particular conversation that we had where you were like, here's why you need to read Fichte for your work on self-relation, didn't automatically lead to me reading Fichte, but it kind of like got stuck in my mind, and then I would periodically revisit it. And then finally one year I decided to teach Fichte, and that was my introduction. And then I decided to like, you know, go more into his work. And so I feel like those kinds of things, it was ultimately me, myself alone, who read Fichte and then also taught Fichte to other students, but it was you who planted the seed. And so I think that's like a nice, I don't know, maybe kind of depiction of what you all are talking about here.
Oh, that's incredibly sweet. I have no memory of that conversation, but it is true. Like, much like dying, one always reads Fichte alone.
Right. I know. Well, while we're on the topic of incredibly sweet, I should just also tell our viewers that Rebekah and David were 2 years ahead of me in grad school, and they were just like the best seminar participants, and everybody was like, oh, Rebekah and David are so smart. We want to be them. So you guys always had like the best responses in seminars. There was also something that your answer brought to mind for me before we move on to the next question. I just wanted to mention, which is citationality practices, which I know like really interest you as well. And I think one of the interesting phenomena that we see today is with more and more of us like going into more public facing philosophy, there's a strange relationship with citationality, because you don't want to be constantly telling people like you need to read XYZ to understand what I'm saying, but it's also important to cite your sources. And I think those of us who have gone into public facing philosophy have struggled with this in certain ways. Like, for instance, Agnes Callard has come under fire for not citing sources. I have been one critic of that. Like, oh, you kind of are philosophizing into the void without recognizing that there's already a community of scholars working on this topic. That was my criticism of her work on sexual consent. But then again, her response to that was, well, this was written for a public audience. I couldn't exactly be super citational. And she's also somebody who really, you know, talks a lot about valuing philosophy and dialogue. So I think that there are complex questions regarding how we do justice to the work that we are either explicitly drawing on or maybe not drawing on, but should be drawing on, because we do have a responsibility, I would say, to make sure that we're familiar with the literature that we claim to be contributing to. But then again, we don't want to be super alienating by just like constantly referring to other people's thoughts.
Yeah, I think there's actually also just like a kind of base professional level here where it's not just about intellectual like indebtedness, but it's also just a matter of like allowing people with lesser, maybe less prominent public platforms to be recognized for their work, which has real professional implications. My impulse is always to go back to the material.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and speaking of the material, I wanted to ask you about this because you mentioned earlier in our conversation that the myths of professional philosophy, they're not just like sort of abstract ideas. They're myths that are materially baked into our profession's very structure. And so I'd love to hear you say more about the material conditions in which these myths flourish.
Yeah, shall I take this, David?
Go for it.
Okay, I've just been talking a lot. I don't want to be the endlessly.
We love it. Rebekah, you're the one we don't usually get to hear. Although I did also remember you have been featured on an Overthink YouTube video once before, right?
I don't think I have, no.
Oh, okay.
No.
Wait, David, I thought you interviewed Rebekah years ago for something.
I don't
Nope.
think so. I don't remember.
Definitely not.
You
Yeah.
guys, maybe I dreamed it. Maybe I dreamed it. Anyway, Rebekah, you were going to just answer. So, yeah, you said you were talking too much. Look at me. Go.
All right. So, in terms of the materialism of the book, we're looking at philosophy as a material practice, as you noted in your question. And, one of the things about mythology is we take them to be material insofar as they affect our actual practices on the ground, right? But they also have a function of obscuring from view certain aspects of our material practice. And I think the best way to kind of articulate what this means more concretely is to use an example. So, and we have this idea that to do philosophy is a vocation, by which I mean a kind of spiritual calling, right? When we're doing philosophy, there's a sense in which it's not meant to feel like work. We're pursuing our intellectual interests. We're doing what we love. We're even kind of on a mission, right? Especially if we relate to that to this myth of like the philosopher as maverick, the philosopher, the relationship to truth and an obligation to speak the truth to power. And this has the effect of spiritualizing our work to the point where often we don't, it obscures the fact that we actually are in a labor market, that our material practices do exist within universities as an institution, that even our choice of subject matter does not just come from us. It comes from, what is likely to get published, right? What is going to advance our professional profiles? And these are all things that we might consider on some level, but we still think of it, right, as being something we are pursuing for its own sake. And we may even feel that way, and I know I feel that way very often, but this means we don't see ourselves as workers, and we're less likely, right, to take up common cause with other workers at the university. It also means that we undergo pretty intense self-exploitation, frankly, in terms of our working hours and how we think about our labor. And we also this also feeds into a kind of meritocratic myth, right, where we think of our recognition and our professional capacities as reflecting our innate value, which has the converse effect of having us, whether consciously or unconsciously, even if we would disavow it, thinking of having that tenure track or that tenure job as being because we worked so hard for it. And those adjuncts, if they work hard enough and if they're good enough, they might make it, right? And so we look at all of these various material practices that are downstream from this notion of the philosopher as the one who's pursuing truth for its own sake. And so the myth is reflected in material practices and has material effects and obscures our view. In this sense, the myths do serve an ideological function.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say that when we think about myths, we often think about like stories and ideas, and that puts myths sometimes in the idealist side of that philosophical equation of idealist versus materialist. But in the book, we really want to make the claim that myths are material practices. They are stories that material people tell one another that shape the material relations in their community and that affect their lives in very concrete ways. And especially the depoliticizing function of myth gets a pretty central place in our book. So, for example, we have a whole book. We do have a whole book, but we have a whole chapter in the book about the problem of adjunctification in academia, especially in philosophy, and why it is that we can't seem to bridge the two-culture divide and form relationships of solidarity between those of us who are on the tenure track or already tenured and those who are in the non-tenure side of things. And so that's as material as it can get. We also talk about the ways in which academics, because we have this vocational interpretation of our own work, where we are so lucky that we get to be philosophers, that we end up engaging in these forms of auto-exploitation that lead to burnout, where we're sending emails to students and grading at 11 p.m. on a Saturday, at 7 a.m. on a Sunday, when we no longer recognize any distinction between what is work time and what is leisure time, because our working conditions have ensured that the line between those two is completely erased. One final illustration of this is our analysis of publishing. So you mentioned that our book is priced at a really unreasonable price. It is over $100. We had no say in that whatsoever. And the reason for that also has to do with the material realities of academic publishing. For better or worse, in our culture, in our academic culture, to be a philosopher means to publish. And to publish means to transform your ideas into either an article or a book. And articles and books are commodities that have to be bought and rented in order for people to have access. So we're already within an explicitly capitalist frame of operation. And so we talk about the way in which the very telos of what it means to be a philosopher, right? I want to publish books and I want to share my ideas with others. The end point of that trajectory is literally the act of selling your ideas so that they become somebody else's property and they profit off of your own creativity, right? Many people don't know this, but academics make $0 for the most part from the articles that we publish. Sometimes we get a few cents here and there from book contracts, but even when you share the details of what those terms, the terms of those contracts are, people are appalled. So for example, when I published my book on animal dreaming, people thought I would just rake in the money. And it's like, no, I get maybe $1 or so, actually maybe less than that per unit that is sold. So if I sell in the whole course of my career 1,000 copies, which is already a lot for academics, it means that I got paid $1,000 for a book that took years and years to produce. And so this is the kind of material reality that we talk about in the book.
Yeah, and I think some people would respond to that by saying, well, your writing is built in some way to your salary. And that's true, David, for you and me. But Rebekah, that's not true for you, and so I think there's also, this speaks to the adjunct crisis too. And I felt, I felt this way very strongly before I got a tenure track job too. I was just like, why would I work on my book when there's literally, it's not part of my contract. I was making, and this was a lucky position to be in relative to other adjuncts. I was making the starting salary of an LAUSD kindergarten teacher, having a PhD and working at a really top tier liberal arts college. And so, yeah, I think that also, there's a way that the kind of labor that, is valued for those of us who are adjuncts versus those of us who are tenure track is very different. And most of us like to write more than anything, right? And only for some of us is writing built into our salaries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the notion that it's built into your salary is probably a little bit misleading, because when you write something, it's to build your own professional profile and obviously to bring prestige to the school, but you are being paid fundamentally to teach undergraduates, which is where the school is getting its money, right? Yeah. They're not getting money from you selling, generously 150 library copies of a book. I'm speaking of our book, not yours, to be clear. Yeah. They're not making money off of that. They're making money off of your teaching. And then when you assign our book in a class, then you're going to have to pay a corporation that's paywalling this stuff, right? So the people who are actually really making that money off of your, I would say, free labor, is these publishers.
Yeah. Fair. All right. Well, we could really go more deeply into that, but
my God.
For purposes of time, we should probably move on to the final question, which is that one thing that people might be surprised by, given your critique of the myths of professional philosophy, is that you don't want to demythologize philosophy, but instead remythologize it. What does that mean to you? And what sorts of myths would you like to see replace the current myths that we have?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. So we actually describe this notion that philosophy does away with all myth as philosophy's myth. Maybe we were being a little bit cute, but no, we actually meant that. And I don't think it's possible to do away with myth in the sense that we're using the term myth, right? It's the problem with these myths is not just that they're false. In some senses, they are somewhat true of our activity, as you pointed out earlier, but rather because of the ways that they obscure huge parts of our institutional lives and things that shape our professional identities. And so the problem with these myths is not that they're false. It's that they perform a function of hiding certain aspects of our lives. And we can't really do away with myths because the moment we think we've done away with myths, that's re-inscribing another myth, right? So what we want to do is, instead of demythologizing, as you alluded to in your question, we want to remythologize philosophy, i.e. find myths that are going to expand our vision of what it means to be a philosopher and can lead us towards a place where we have a clearer picture, right, of what it is we actually do. And we have a couple of directions. I want to throw it over to David, though. I feel like I've talked a lot.
No, so yeah, we do have a couple of directions that we allude to in the book of what it might mean concretely to reimagine these myths, or we actually we take the term refigure myth from the philosopher Pamela Sue Anderson, who says it's not
Pamela
about...
Sue Anderson?
Yeah.
I don't know Pamela Sue Anderson's work. I posted recently on Substack that I was behind Pamela Anderson, like the Pamela Anderson, in the rising in philosophy. For some reason, Pamela Anderson's Substack is listed as philosophy. But I didn't know that there was a real philosopher, Pamela Sue Anderson.
Pamela S. Anderson. And she says, look, you can't just throw myths out because they do perform an important function. And so the point is to tweak them and refigure them in critical ways so that they have different material effects than the dominant ones in the present. And so, for example, we talk about the myth of the philosopher as one and what it might mean for us to imagine ourselves not as Descartes in a stove-heated room by themselves thinking thoughts, but rather as philosophers engaging with others in dialogue, maybe emphasizing aspects of our own history that lend themselves to that interpretation. Why not foreground Socrates engaging people in dialogue in the Agora? Why not foreground the disputations of the medievals? Why not foreground the Republic of Letters? Why not foreground the philosophical salons that were very influential in the 18th century? There are all these resources that our own history makes available to us that have not been mythologized in that same way, and that if we were to maybe start promoting or peddling, let's say, new myths, we would have a different form of relating to one another that might be helpful. And the other example of this is the idea that philosophers find their essence in writing and publishing. This idea that if you publish, then you become a real philosopher. We think that does have some damaging consequences for our profession, especially because it leads to the devaluation of our teaching, which is a relational practice. And so what if we envision the philosopher not as a researcher who has to teach in order to pay the bills, but as a teacher and a mentor who occasionally can write if they choose to or not? And so foregrounding the pedagogical dimensions can also lead to new myths that maybe lead to different people envisioning philosophy as a career for them and living that out in different terms than maybe those of us who came to it because we had this particular myth of being researchers, and I include myself in that category, right? Yeah. And so there are a lot of myths that can be tweaked, corrected, or refigured. But one important point about this that we make is that no myth is ever going to have traction if you just invent it out of the blue. It's not as if you just get to create a new myth from thin air. You actually have to anchor it in the history of a profession, in the history of a discipline, in the practices of a community. And that's why for us, who were all trained in the history of philosophy, the history of philosophy is a really good place to go for that, because that history is richer than its official account suggests.
Yeah. And also, I wanted to add, sorry.
No, go ahead. We'll close. But yes, add in a quick thing.
Oh, just the quick thing is also, even the philosopher as maverick, we don't want to do away with entirely, but we want to institute as something that is aspirational rather than something we have by default. This notion that, philosophers ought to have a sort of responsibility to actually be genuinely like a maverick, but that's not a position you have simply by being by yourself and being a philosopher. Yeah. That's all I'll say.
Yeah. So reclaim the revolutionary power, but don't take it for granted. Thank you both so much for your time and for your work, for your exploited labor on this project. But I really love the critical position that you're taking and encouraging us to all think about the ways that professional philosophy partakes in and contributes to these really damaging ways of understanding our profession. So really appreciate it. Definitely recommend to our viewers to encourage your libraries to purchase a copy of the book. Mm-hmm. And Rebekah, welcome for the first, apparently first, but hopefully not last time, to our YouTube channel.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Ellie.